Perfect. Well, I want to welcome everyone to our virtual HPU session on social justice. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I'm the provost here at Hawaii Pacific University, and I just want to extend a warm welcome to all of you wherever you may be. It's morning here, but I know it's afternoon and evening on the mainland and internationally. So wherever you're tuning in, we're really glad to have you with us. I'm excited to have a question and answer session, a discussion with one of our colleagues here at HPU, Sterling Higa. And I thought I'd give a quick introduction and then we'll dive right in. I know this is a hot topic and we want to make sure we leave time for questions. Sterling is a debate coach here in Hawaii Pacific. He's also a lecturer in the Department of Communications. He writes for Hawaii Business Magazine in addition to other local media outlets. He also holds a Master's of Education from the Arts and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And he's finishing up his doctorate degree here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And as he likes to describe himself, although I don't know I would agree with this, he says he is often wrong but seeks truth. So Sterling, thanks so much for joining me. And we're excited to hear your thoughts on social justice and have a great conversation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me, Provost Walsh. Or Jennifer, as I should call you.
Yeah, please do. We'll make this very casual and informal because we're good friends. So let's talk a little bit about the context here. I mean, this has been such an interesting season, right? Between the global pandemic and some of the recent conversations about social justice and racial inequality, structural discrimination. How do you think of this in a context that makes sense for our students, or how would you present it historically that seems to identify why this is such a unique season for us?
Sure. I think one of the factors that's contributed to the scale of the crisis, so to speak, is that this is an election year. Every time we have an election year, the issues that divide us become more divisive, they become more intense, and people tend to double down on their beliefs in either direction. So there's more partisan disagreement. And this election year has coincided with probably two of the largest crises that the United States has faced in a long time, and indeed the globe. You have a global pandemic, and coupled with that global pandemic, you have a severe economic contraction. I was reading in the Financial Times that if you look at global trade volume, it goes like this, and then when it hits COVID-19, it just falls basically to the floor. And these are making a lot of people feel insecure and afraid. And in that situation, all of the dynamics that were playing out before just become louder and more intense. So I would say it just turns up the volume on everything that was happening before, because these discussions that we're having about the criminal justice system and about access to healthcare and about inequality in the economy, we've been having them for decades. Civil rights is not a new issue in the United States, but the confluence of all these events has just accelerated them and made them more intense.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I'm wondering too, with our regular activities suspended because of the pandemic, where we're all home more, there's less to distract us. We are, perhaps probably for the first time in a good long while, having a national conversation around things that all of us are seeing play out, on our TV screens, on our computer screens, and our social media feeds. When I was young, because I'm old now, but when I was young, we didn't have cable TV and we didn't have all the diversification of information outlets. And so it was easier to have a focused national conversation because there wasn't a whole lot to compete with. And I think in the last 20 to 30 years, with the sources of information becoming so diversified, it's made it difficult for us to really focus on the same thing at the exact same time. But I guess if anything good can come out of a global pandemic, having our regular routines, upended and suspended has given us the time that I think we have, that's long overdue, to really focus on some of the oppressive systemic forces right in our midst that we are often blind to for those that are a part of the majority culture. Am I off base on that, or is that something that you have observed as well?
I think you're definitely right. You know, when you've had just three television stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, you have a sort of narrative that is dominant. And that's good in some ways and it's bad in others. It's good because it means we're all focused on the same issues. And it's bad because sometimes minority voices aren't heard or represented in those institutions. The internet has sort of disrupted things because cable news was still sort of the same. You still have a sort of gated narrative and institutions that govern what gets talked about. But as soon as you have social media, people can record things on their smartphones, upload them to Twitter or YouTube, and within a day, the murder of George Floyd can have millions of people seeing this, 8 minutes of horror without a single television station needing to choose to cover it. Mm-hmm. And so this has democratized our way of communicating. But as it democratizes, it also tends to splinter. So you obviously have some people who watch the video of George Floyd and are horrified and amplify their disgust and outrage. And then you have other people who watch different clips. So maybe they watch a clip of somebody who's injured at a protest by protesters, or somebody spitting in the face of a police officer, and they just accelerate into that sort of, we call them, echo chambers or thought bubbles. But I like to think of it as a sort of museum where it used to be we were all walking around in a museum and there were curators and it was a limited museum. And then once you have the internet, the length of the corridors in the museums can stretch to infinity. Mm-hmm. And so we get to curate the walls ourselves, but we end up just walking down one gallery forever in whatever direction we want to go in. And it's difficult for people to get back to the lobby to have a discussion about what's going on in the museum as a whole, because they're all, one wing is maybe the Black Lives Matter wing of the museum. The other is the All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter wing of the museum. And these wings aren't necessarily touching each other anymore. Or when they do touch, there's a conflict between the people between them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I definitely can see that analogy, even in this last week's conversation where some of these older cases of police misconduct and oppressive violence are starting to come back to light. The heartbreaking story of Elijah McClain that's just come out recently, is kind of resurrecting some of those conversations, at least in one wing of the museum. But it in such a way that I think it's really starting to get the attention of our population as a whole. And of course, we know that the conversation around police misconduct and violence has really started to spill over into other areas of pluralistic examination, with the call for removal of certain statues, for example, or symbols of the Confederate flag or former Confederacy, renaming of music groups so that they are stripped of their Civil War connections. What do you make of this? Is this just a healthy part of our pluralistic democracy where we are re-examining what it means to be American in today's day and age? Or do you see something else at play here?
I think it's difficult to say now, because you never know what will happen next week or next month or a year from now. Obviously, in all historical moments, people are looking to the past and perhaps looking at it critically to see whether certain narratives have been prioritized over others. I think right now we're just seeing the most dramatic version of that critical analysis of history. So the people who are tearing down statues, I think, have legitimate grievances, but the volume, again, has just been turned up by the recent events, by the pandemic, by the economic precarity. So what normally would be, maybe we read Howard Zinn and we think a people's history of the United States and think, the way that we teach history in this country is perhaps triumphalist and celebrates an American narrative that is not necessarily representative of what actually happened. Normally we might have a conversation and it's just a sort of civil conversation about, is the way we teach history appropriate? Now we're having that turned up to 11, where it's, are these statues, emblematic of the things that we value? And I don't know that in the current moment, it's possible to have this sort of nuanced conversation. But I imagine that as if tensions decrease, we can have a more nuanced conversation. Obviously, if tensions increase, then we might have to tear down all of the statues.
Right, right. And, so I'm thinking too about, yesterday in the news, there was conversation about the Captain Cook statues here in Hawaii, which is, probably the closest we can get to some of the conversations that are happening in the former Confederate South. But the conversations in Hawaii, from what I can tell, are much, I would say, calmer. They are more nuanced in many ways. What do you attribute to that? Why is Hawaii, I guess, taking this in a much more, I don't want to say muted fashion in a negative connotation, but it's a different conversation here. So give me your thoughts on that.
I think this will require a little bit of history, and I hope there are no history professors here to tell me how I'm getting it wrong. But this is my rehashing of Hawaiian history from my education here. I grew up in Honolulu, and we have a sort of complex racial history here because you start with Native Hawaiians, and then you add European missionaries, and then you add plantation laborers from China, Japan, the Philippines, and you also add people from Puerto Rico, Russia, Norway, and many other places who came to work on the plantations. You add immigrants from Asia, including Koreans, Thais, Laotians, add immigrants from the Pacific, Samoans, Tongans, add immigrants from Micronesia, including from the Marshall Islands and Guam. Then you rotate in military forces from the United States that are stationed here, and you add 10 million visitors a year. And the result is a lot of diversity and a dynamic that doesn't really permit these sort of clean divisions. So when we talk about, say, issues in the criminal justice system here in Hawaii, we may be talking about discrimination against Native Hawaiians, but it might also be discrimination against Micronesians. And different groups are affected in different ways. So the way that people talk about race relations in the United States often gets boiled down to this sort of black-white dichotomy. In Hawaii especially, the black-white dichotomy doesn't quite fit because of the unique history that we have here.
Mm-hmm. Some of those, coming from Los Angeles, which is where I grew up and lived for all of my life until I moved here, some of the conversations are very similar when I think about it from a socioeconomic perspective. So the structural inequalities that we see in our educational systems, for example, or in our healthcare systems, where we have such great disparities in health outcomes, or even the opportunities for advancement that seem to still lean heavily towards those that subscribe to a majority culture. I see those same conversations happening here in Hawaii, even though the population makeup looks different from a demographic perspective. Would you agree that that's been your experience as well?
I would agree that those issues are important, and they're also inflected through what I think is probably the most important and unresolved issue in Hawaii politics, which is, what are the obligations to Native Hawaiians and the indigenous people here? It's a question that has never been settled. In the 70s, you have the creation of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs after the Constitutional Convention, which goes some way to redress some of the harms. But I think with the protests on Mauna Kea, the protests at Sherwood, the protests about the wind farms, you have the intersection of environmental concerns with a strong movement that is concerned for the indigenous people. And, some of those people want sovereignty, others of them just want more resources to be dedicated to Native Hawaiians. So there's a lot of diversity within that movement. But I think what unifies them is a notion that the current arrangement is unjust for the Native Hawaiians. And so we have social justice concerns in Hawaii, but I would say that's probably the strongest manifestation of those concerns is, what are our obligations to Native Hawaiians?
Right. And so much of that links back to the land and, the issue of ownership of the land or stewardship of the land, which is so important to Hawaiian culture and values. And that may not be the same way on the mainland, where land has been, occupied and traded and passed from population to population, throughout a longer period of history, at least, Western history. And so the conversations are a little bit more around economic mobility and some of the, there are some land implications when you think about environmental prejudice and people living close to landfills or unsafe environmental conditions. And I know that that's part of the conversation here too, when we think about the land and how the land's being properly utilized as a precious resource. And, again, as a newcomer and listening to some of these conversations, it strikes me though, that there does seem to be perhaps a little bit greater sense of unity, even though the conversations often fall into very familiar patterns around structural discrimination and systemic racism and inequalities. Nonetheless, there seems to be this communal sense of unity that pervades even those conversations. And I don't know if it's, being in an island nation, an island community, we have to all work together if we're going to survive, right? In case of a natural disaster or just isolation, there's a sense that we have to work together to preserve what's so special about Hawaii, that maybe insulates some of our conversations from the sharpness that we might see elsewhere. So that's just my observation again as a newcomer, but I do appreciate the emphasis on communal values and community definitions of success that aren't always present in other conversations.
Yeah, I think Hawaii, we do have the idea that we're on the same boat because, an island is a place floating in the middle of the ocean, and so many things in Hawaii are interconnected. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we're witnessing this now with the downturn in tourism and the way that this has had economic impacts ripple throughout the community. At one point, a third of the working population was unemployed. And so there is, I think, more will here, communal will to make change. And the interesting thing is we also have a lot of strong networks in Hawaii. So people from different ethnic groups work together, so they feel a sense of unity. And so I think here, more than a lot of places, we have the potential to really enact positive change.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I so appreciate about HPU as an institution, a university, is that we really kind of represent that unity within a diversified space. So the way I try to describe it when I'm visiting on the mainland or talking to friends and colleagues is that, we're a microcosm of the world. We're in a downtown urban location. Of course, we're right on this, beautiful ocean. So we've got that natural geographic beauty that's juxtaposed or next to this diverse urban economic culture. And even our own student body. We have, the diversity of Hawaiian students who come from Hawaii and all of the different educational institutions here, but we also have international students from Australia and New Zealand and Japan and Korea and China and Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. So it's very diverse there. And of course, then all of our mainland students come from the remaining 49 states, not just the West Coast. And I know that you've taught here for a while. How do you see that shaping the conversations in the classroom? What does that look like when you're teaching such a diverse group of students?
I think it's always excellent to have that diversity because, especially for American students, very often when we talk about the United States, we forget the rest of the world. And so in my argumentation and debate classes and in the debate team, it's very helpful to have international students who very often have radically different perspectives on things because they don't come out of this American context. They don't view the world in terms of, Democrats versus Republicans. And the nuance that gets added to all of the discussions that we have in class is so much more because of that diversity. And then also we have a large veteran population. So we have many traditional students who are coming to college out of their time in high school or secondary school. And then you have people who are coming to school after serving in the military. They may have more life experience. They may have traveled the world during their time in service. And I find often that there will be perspectives that come up that just completely shift the conversation and open people's eyes in different directions. And I think that's one of the best aspects, especially in debate where we want to have different perspectives meet and inform each other. That's always been helpful.
Yeah, and I so appreciate the political diversity, not only here at HPU, but here in Hawaii in general. Again, California has, I would say, a more, I would say, polarized population. I mean, you certainly have, if, I'm a political scientist, so I look a lot at, demographic and political maps and electoral college outcomes. And certainly when you look at congressional districts in the state of California, for example, you see there are districts where, they're very, very partisan on the Republican side, or they're very partisan on the Democratic side from a party perspective. And there's not a lot of middle ground. Most counties, for example, in the last election were very much skewed heavily towards one candidate or another. And so that, depending on where you lived, and I know this is not unique to Southern California, but wherever you lived, I think that really helped to shape the conversation. And it also, going back to our original conversation about the diversification of news sources, the local paper tended to be very, I would say slanted, because I don't want to be accused of saying fake news, but it was certainly representative of a type of conversation that was happening in the community. And that's what's so nice about Hawaii, coming as, again, a newcomer. The conversations are pretty diverse, even politically. It's not as polarized as someone who hasn't lived here might think, because we have a diversity of occupations here. The military population, of course, lends a certain perspective that I think is so helpful for us, and we depend on our military partners here on island, going back to Pearl Harbor days. We've got, local issues that span a variety of political perspectives. Anyway, it's just a nice change of conversation to see this diversification even on the political spectrum that is, I think, unique to some parts of the world today, where it's a little easier to become skewed and more polarized in your thinking.
Yeah, I think some people look at Hawaii and they see a Democrat-controlled House and Senate and governorship and imagine, oh, this is just one political, it's a one-party state. But the primary is coming up on August 8th, and the diversity among the candidates within just the Democratic Party is immense. You have conservative candidates, you have more progressive candidates. And even though we would look at a district map and see blue, 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 that masks the underlying political diversity in Hawaii.
Yeah, I know. I wholeheartedly agree, and that's what I think makes it so fun. As a scholar and as a teacher, I'm eager to see the results of this next election, so I can dive in and try to figure out a little bit more about my new state, because it's certainly been fun to see this process so far. So I know, speaking of debate, you are leading our debate team again next year. And I'm sure that this conversation around social justice and structural inequalities and systemic racism is going to feature heavily in some of your conversations. So give us a quick preview about what you have planned with your students, and no spoiler alerts if it's a surprise for our student teams.
So our debate society meets twice a week, and we compete on tournaments here on island, and we also travel. Because of the COVID-19, a lot of debate tournaments now are being held online, which is very exciting for us. Because in a normal year, we can't obviously go to tournaments every weekend, as some schools on the East Coast might be able to because they can just drive. But now that tournaments are moving online, we can attend more tournaments than ever before. And we discuss a lot of different topics. The format of debate we practice is British parliamentary debate. So you have 15 minutes to prepare after seeing a topic, and you're expected to come up with different perspectives. So there are two teams on each side of the debate. And what this does is it forces people to go beyond the most obvious knee-jerk arguments that come up on either side of a topic and really explore it more in depth. And because we cover many different topics, the students on the team get exposed to different sorts of issues. We talk about economic issues, we talk about international relations, we talk about race relations, the questions that are sort of gripping the country right now, public health issues, criminal justice issues. And so it's very fun every week because we get to explore different issues. And because the debate society, everyone knows each other and is comfortable with each other, we're often able to, transcend what you might have in a conversation with people where you're afraid of saying the wrong thing or offending someone. The debate society is a place where you can try out ideas, and it's okay to get it wrong. And then we talk about ways to make the arguments more persuasive, or ways that there are flaws in the argument, so that people are able to better understand their own thinking and the thinking of people who they might disagree with.
Yeah. And I think, this idea of being able to disagree about how to achieve a certain outcome is something that we're still learning as a society, even though we've been a democracy now for almost 250 years. And I think most Americans, when they, Independence Day is coming up, and when they read the Declaration of Independence and they, see these words that, we believe that all people are created equal, I think there's an inherent adherence to that. Like, yes, we all believe that we are equal, but of course, these conversations around social justice and structural inequalities, don't allow for just a superficial response of, well, we're all equal, or the law says we're all equal. And when you're wrestling, and I'm also mindful today is the 5th anniversary of the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationally as part of a constitutional underlying premise of equality. And for a long time, that was a source of robust debate about whether or not same-sex marriage should have the same standing as traditional heterosexual marriage. So these are interesting debate conversations that could potentially break relationships. So how do you, as a debate coach, help our students or your colleagues wrestle with conversations that really get into people's value systems in a way that that allows for productive conversation without disrupting those relationships? I don't know if I said that correctly, but how do you argue well? That's basically what it is.
This is day one of my argumentation and debate class, is telling people not to debate with the people they love. Very often, when we think of debate, there's an audience, and you're trying to score points by showing that the other side is wrong. And when we watch debates on TV, that's what we think a debate is supposed to be. So when we go to debate our friends or our family, we take that approach where we imagine, oh, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, and then you're going to change your mind. So on the first day, I have to tell students that's not a helpful way of thinking about persuading people or having good conversations with them. And instead, I think of conversations as a way to better understand what people think. So, I wouldn't be an academic if let me see if I have it here, didn't recommend a book. This is the book that I recommend to people. It's How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. A lot of practical tips for having conversations, but the 3 that I try to tell students and try myself to practice. The first is listening to learn. So when you're talking to someone in a conversation, even if you want to change someone's mind, you should always just approach the conversation as an opportunity to learn yourself, because you may be wrong, or there may be something you don't know that the other person knows. And so listening is the only way that we can figure those things out. So listening is probably the first thing. The second thing is asking questions. I think that sometimes the most persuasive thing you can do is fully understand what someone believes and how they're thinking. And the only way to do that most times is to ask questions to uncover what are their assumptions, how are they reasoning, why are they drawing the conclusions, have they thought about this issue or that issue. And the last thing is just not to force beliefs on people. So a lot of people think that belief is binary. It's 1 or it's 0, it's black or it's white. But really, persuasion and belief is like this gradient where there's lots of shades and increments in between. So if you're trying to persuade somebody, for instance, that climate change is a severe threat to the world, and someone right now doesn't believe that climate change exists, you're not going to move them in one conversation all the way. So sometimes people want to force their beliefs, and if somebody won't go all the way, they become angry or upset. But I think you have to look at a conversation, especially with your friends and family, as this is a conversation that spans months and years. You're not going to solve all of the problems in an afternoon. So if you listen to learn, if you ask questions, and if you're willing to step back and not force your beliefs on people, I think it's possible to have very productive conversations where you learn and the other person learns and the relationship is still strong at the end of it.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really helpful advice. And, underlying what you were saying, I was thinking, the emotional connection still needs to be there, right? So, it's one of those things where if you remain committed to fellowship and being emotionally connected to the person you're engaged in conversation with, it's hard then to devolve into just a battle of facts, because you recognize that we all are coming at it with our own perspective and our own opinions and value systems. But at the end of the day, if we can agree on, that we have a certain shared humanity that really invites further exploration, I think that's a great starting point, because, we're not robots, and we have, emotions that are in play. And I think too often we think that, when we have a debate or discussion where we're supposed to divorce ourselves of that humanity. And I find that's not really helpful in many cases. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important to know that there's a person on the other side of the conversation who has feelings and can be hurt by what you say, and not forget that. Which is why the advice I give to a lot of people is don't have arguments and debates on social media. Because when you're looking at an avatar, you forget that there's a person on the other side. And because sometimes on social media there's an audience, it becomes like a debate where people are trying to score points rather than really trying to understand the other person. So,
right. That's great advice.
Conversation is best.
Yes, I say that's great advice. And I always try to remind myself never to post anything on social media that I wouldn't say to a person if they were standing right in front of me, right? Because, that helps to make it a real thing, no matter, what the issue might be. So to kind of take us full circle, to go back into the original premise for this conversation, we're seeing in many ways a simplified debate with the hashtags of Black Lives Matter and hashtag All Lives Matter, recognizing that, of course, the full conversation is so much more complex. How would you, if you had two people and both are, doing their competing hashtags, how would you start that conversation to lead to a more productive outcome?
That's a tough one. I'll do my best. I think the first is just to clarify what people value. So most people, I think, care about other people and want them to be happy and healthy. And if people can start with that, as an assumption, before we start talking about people's races or what political party they're part of, if people are able to agree, we both want people to be happy and healthy, right? Okay. And, we both want our relationship and each other to be happy and healthy. You sort of start with just these very basic things, and then you can move to the points of disagreement. But very often it's starting with the premises that people agree on. Do we agree that we shouldn't use violence against people? Because I think most people would agree that if we're trying to persuade people, we shouldn't use violence. Starting with those commonplaces, core values, very often I think make the surface discussion a lot smoother. But if we go the opposite way, if we start with what we're most disagreed about, then we're very unlikely to uncover the things that we do agree on in the core values. And so with people that it's often a lot easier to do this, but it's worthwhile to remember that most people share values. Most people care about their families, they care about their communities, they care about their friends, they want their communities to be happy and healthy. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, it would be great, more poverty, more crime, more disease. Right. On those things, we're all united.
Right. Well, and I think, to end this, and we'll open it up for questions, but one of the things that unites us here in Hawaii and at HPU is our shared values of Pono and Kuleana. So if you don't mind, since you grew up here in Honolulu, you probably can articulate it a little bit more, cogently than me. Explain that for our audience if we have people who are tuning in from off island.
I could try, with the caution that I'm not a speaker of Hawaiian and by no means an expert, but I know that Hawaiian words have, they're polysemous, so they have multiple meanings. And with a word like pono, which is one of HPU's core values, often we talk about pono as just righteousness, but this definition, to me at least, seems incomplete because it also means goodness, uprightness, morality, excellence, well-being. And it implies integrity, not just like personal integrity like me, but integrity of a community, like a society fitting together. And sometimes we divorce words like pono from their historical and cultural context, and that loses the resonance. Because in the ancient native Hawaiian world, this word pono means a harmonious relationship between like the akua, the gods, the ali'i, the kahuna, the people of the land itself. This harmonious relationship that encompasses all of these different parts. So I view that word in terms of harmonious relationships, and it's about balance, and so in that way, it's very similar to when we talk about social justice. I think pono and social justice to me are sort of these similar concepts. But when we think about pono, it actually deepens our understanding of social justice because we think about those harmonious relationships. And then in Kuleana, use this word to mean responsibility, accountability. But for me, it's a responsibility that's grounded in like history and ancestry, because it's what am I obligated to do? What am I responsible for? But also who am I responsible to? And that includes my ancestors who came before me, but it also includes my children and their children's children. So it's this it's a larger concept than I can explain in words that encompasses, your position in society and your obligations to it. And I think that that's, for me at least, I find that very helpful in thinking through questions of social justice and these discussions we're having. Because it's bigger, we could think like, oh, what are my duties or my responsibilities or my obligations? But these words are very cold, whereas something like Kuleana is more expansive. It's a concept that has more resonance, especially in a place like Hawaii where we are close to the land and can see that culture in practice.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I have learned just as much listening to you in these few minutes that I have, being here for months already. So thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom. And I know we've got time, Keela, for questions. So I know you were the question keeper. So if there are any that are coming in, let us know. And then if you want to use your chat function for those who are still on the call, feel free to type in your questions and we'll get to them.
So we've got one so far. Do you think it can be problematic when we use this narrative that Hawaii is different and special? Does that serve to erase some of the discussions of colonization, racism, and oppression that occurs here?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Yeah, I think, as I say, my perspective is that we do have a lot of those same dynamics that we are seeing replicated in other global conversations that have been, linked to colonialism. But Sterling, what do you think?
There are narratives that transcend this particular context, like colonization, which occurred all around the world, racism, which seems to be a structural feature of human societies, and oppression, which seems to have existed in all societies. I don't think it could potentially be viewed as problematic, but I think it's accurate to say that Hawaii is a unique context, just as each context has to be analyzed in its particularity. Hawaii has a particular history of colonization and particular dynamics of racism and particular oppression. So I think it's more, when we talk about Hawaii as different and special, if we're saying like Hawaii is special, is like it's a magical racial paradise where everybody gets along great, obviously that's a problematic way of describing Hawaii. But when we say Hawaii is unique in that, the plantation history here is very different than a lot of other places where there were plantations. That's just accurate. So I think we have to separate out, we don't want to use this difference or specialness to mean like exceptional, like, wow, Hawaii. But we do need to recognize that Hawaii, I think, is different. I think that's accurate.
And it's interesting because about a year ago, there was a debate or discussion in the New York Times that started with an opinion piece that someone wrote to say, if you want to look at a community or society that seems to do handle racism better, look to Hawaii. And that was a very fascinating discussion because on the one hand, you know, it did address some of the communal aspects of the value system that craft solutions that look a little different than other places. However, as a lot of people then wrote in afterwards and said, well, Hawaii is not this utopian paradise where somehow discrimination and racism doesn't exist. Because that's unfortunately a part of human nature, and it seems to be prevalent, especially in places that have a history of colonization and conquering as part of the history. So it was interesting that the question made me think about that particular debate that happened of all places in New York. So that, you know, we do want to make sure that people understand, you know, this is not utopia. We have the same problems here as everywhere else. But I think because of the unique history, it does give us a different way of thinking about it and processing it. That is, you know, grounded in the factual realities of how Hawaii came to be. Great. Any other questions, Keela?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. Well, this is our chance to, you know, then have a free for all. If anyone else is on the call, we'd love to talk a little bit about anything on your mind. It is Aloha Friday, so I recognize that people may be doing other things than hanging out in front of their computers on a Zoom call. But I know that especially with today and the, you know, kind of reflecting on the significance of the Supreme Court precedent that was there 5 years ago, and a little fun anecdote, I was actually at the Supreme Court when that announcement came through for the Obergefell decision, just serendipitously. I happened to be in Washington and I knew the decision was pending. It was that and a death penalty case. Those were the two big cases still pending. And so I thought, you know, in either case, it's going to be a pretty significant precedent, but if it's the Obergefell decision, it's going to make history. And it was such a unique thing to be there at the court. And for those of you who've never seen how the Supreme Court functions, it's very old school where you have printed opinions that are shared with the press on paper. And so the interns that work at the court take the opinions that when they're printed, they sprint across the platform or the steps of the plaza there and hand it to the press. And so I was watching this young intern in heels run as fast as she could with this opinion that was literally hot off the press, hand it to the press. And of course they're scanning, trying to figure out what the decision was. And it was just an amazing memory about, you know, the nature of equality and what that looked like in today's day and age. So I thought I'd fill the time with that fun little anecdote. I was reflecting on that this morning.
So one of our students asked, where's the Captain Cook statue that you mentioned was being debated for removal located?
I know there's one on the Big Island. I don't remember. There's a couple of places, right, Sterling?
Yeah, there's at least one on the Big Island, and I think there's at least one on Kauai as well.
Okay. None in Oahu, as far as I can remember. We have the Kamehameha statue and a couple of others. At least I haven't seen it, but maybe it's in other parts.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're, I haven't seen one on Oahu.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Well, any final thoughts for you, Sterling, before we close out our time?
No, I think, you know, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. Obviously, a lot of people are isolated, you know, both in terms of physical isolation, but social isolation as well. And so for me, it's always nice to have a civil conversation where we can explore ideas and talk. That's what I love about debate. That's what I love about teaching at HPU. And so it's nice to have that conversation with you, Jennifer.
Yeah, well, it's great. I know as students are planning on coming back, one of the things that we are planning on for the next year is not only having a series of conversations, so this is really more of a kickoff conversation as we're planning for the fall, but also a way for students to translate their interest and their passion into action. So I know several faculty members are active in the community with various different community groups. And we're going to be putting together opportunities for our own HPU student body and faculty and staff group to really, put their interests into action. Because we know, I don't want to say talk is cheap, because we do a lot of talking here in universities. But at some time, I know that a lot of people desire more than talk, and they really want to try to make a difference in the lives of those who are, facing historic oppression and systemic injustices. So we will be putting together that. We don't have it quite finalized just yet, but that'll be part of our planning for the fall. And undoubtedly it's going to carry over into spring. And really what we're seeing now is a realization that the work is far from being done. It will never be done. And so there will be always opportunities to improve the lives of our neighbors and friends, and to really make our society as healthy and as equal and just as it can be. So stay tuned. We will have definitely more conversation, action items, ways to get involved, so that we can all be working together to make our community and our state as healthy and safe as possible. And with that, if there's no more questions, Keela, I guess we can call it done. What do you think?
Yeah, no more questions. I say everyone enjoy your weekend.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So glad to have you all tuning in. And thank you again to Sterling. I appreciate you being on the hot seat. And I threw a couple curveballs your way, and you handled it beautifully. So thank you. And we'll see you back here on campus soon.